leave you in this.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hollywood Remembers video. Today, we're going to pay a heartfelt tribute to the American stars we've recently lost, as well as other beloved figures around the world who have touched our lives. Before we begin, if this content resonates with you, please leave a like. It helps the channel continue bringing you tributes made with respect and care. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin.
Grady DeMond Wilson has died at the age of 79, according to reports. He was an American actor and author, best known to millions as Lamont Sanford, the steady, long-suffering son on Sanford and Son. For many viewers, DeMond Wilson was the calm center of that show. Week after week, he stood toe-to-toe with Fred Sanford's chaos and sharp tongue, grounding the comedy in something human. Lamont wasn't just a punchline, he was responsibility, patience, the voice of reason when everything else went sideways. That role made Wilson a familiar presence in American living rooms, and it stuck with people. After Sanford and Son, he kept working. He took on the role of Oscar Madison in The New Odd Couple, stepping into a character already loved by audiences. He also appeared on the big screen, including the film Me and the Kid. Over time, his career reflected range, persistence, and a willingness to keep showing up. Wilson was also an author, and later in life he spoke openly about faith, reflection, and change. His story wasn't frozen in one era, it kept moving. Grady DeMond Wilson leaves behind decades of work that still feels familiar and lived in. For many, he'll always be Lamont, the son who tried to keep things together, and in doing that, became unforgettable.
Catherine Ann O'Hara has died at the age of 71, according to reports. She was a Canadian-American actress, comedian, and screenwriter whose career lasted more than 5 decades. For many families around the world, she was instantly recognizable as the mother from Home Alone, a role that became part of holiday tradition. O'Hara began her career in sketch and improvisational comedy, where she quickly stood out for her sharp instincts and fearless choices. She had a gift for making big characters feel grounded and quiet moments feel honest. Over time, she moved comfortably between comedy and drama, never losing that human touch that made her performances feel real. She kept evolving. Long after many expected her to slow down, she reached a new generation of fans through television, most notably with her later work on Schitt's Creek. That role reminded people just how rare her talent was and how much control and intelligence she brought to every scene. Catherine O'Hara's work wasn't loud for the sake of being loud. It stayed with you. It made people laugh, and sometimes it surprised them by how much it felt like home. What she leaves behind is a body of work that still plays, still connects, and still matters.
T.K. Carter has died, according to reports. He was an American actor known for a long list of memorable roles across film and television, and for a lot of people, his name instantly connects to movies they grew up with, especially Space Jam. What stood out about Carter was how easily he could move between worlds. He could be funny, loose, and fast in a comedy, then show up in something darker and more intense and feel like he belonged there too. His credits tell that story. He appeared in films like Corvette Summer, Southern Comfort, The Thing, Dr. Detroit, and Runaway Train, titles that have lasted because they each have a certain grit or charm or cult following that refuses to fade. On television, many viewers remember him from Punky Brewster, which introduced him to families in a completely different way. And later, he showed a more dramatic side in The Corner, proving he could handle material that hit closer to the bone. With actors like T.K. Carter, you realize something over time. Even when they aren't the headline name on the poster, they're part of what makes the whole thing work. They bring texture, they bring life,
They help build scenes people remember for decades. And now, with his passing, what remains is that body of work, the films, the shows, the moments, still there, waiting to be revisited, and still carrying the imprint of a performer who quietly gave a lot.
Gary Gene Watson is more than a respected country music singer. He represents a story about integrity, endurance, and belonging. This is not a portrait driven by spotlight moments or headline-ready drama. It is a narrative about someone who chose to remain loyal to his own center in an industry that often rewards reinvention at any cost. This story is not about commercial success. It is about consistency, about maintaining an inner axis while the world pulls in different directions. From an early age, Gary understood that music was not simply entertainment, it was identity. Not something you put on and take off, but something you carry with you, quietly shaping how you move through life. Raised in rural Texas, he grew up between two contrasting forces. On one side, the discipline of hard work, simple living, and unspoken expectations. On the other, the emotional safety of family gatherings where songs were not performances, but conversations. One side taught structure, the other taught expression. Gary learned to live in the tension between both. Early on, he realized that singing was not about standing out, it was about holding things together. Music became a way to organize feelings that had no other outlet. Instead of hiding emotion, he refined it. Instead of competing for attention, he connected. His talent emerged not as a glamorous gift, but as an emotional defense. When recognition arrived, it came quickly. Recordings turned into radio play. A national hit opened doors in the mid-1970s. His voice traveled farther than he ever had. Validation felt tangible, almost inevitable, after years of quiet dedication. But beneath that momentum, something fragile existed. The structure behind the success did not grow at the same speed as the visibility. Inexperience, unclear financial decisions, and trusting the wrong frameworks created an unseen imbalance. The success was real, the foundation was not. There was no dramatic collapse, no public scandal, just a slow realization that something essential needed correction, a quiet erosion rather than a loud fall. And that is where Gary's story begins to separate itself from others. Instead of denying the problem, he observed it. Instead of assigning blame, he adjusted. That silent recalibration would shape not only the next phase of his career, but his understanding of what success truly meant.
For many artists, a setback becomes a turning point only if the industry allows it. For Gary Gene Watson, the second phase of his career was not granted by trends or reinvention, but by a decision to stay exactly where he was meant to be. When the initial momentum slowed, the industry around him began to change. Country music was shifting toward polish, crossover appeal, and broader commercial formulas. Voices were smoothed, edges softened. The unspoken message was clear: adapt or disappear. For Gary, that message created a quiet conflict. This part of the story is not about resistance for the sake of pride. It is about alignment. Gary understood that his voice carried a specific emotional weight, not flashy, not fashionable, but honest. Altering it might have extended short-term visibility, but at the cost of something deeper. So he chose continuity over expansion. Rather than chasing radio trends, he leaned into live performance. The road became his recalibration. Small venues, dedicated listeners, rooms where silence mattered as much as applause. In those spaces, he rediscovered something essential: connection without spectacle. This period did not look like success from the outside. Fewer chart headlines, less media attention, but internally it was stabilizing.
singing for people who came specifically to hear him, not a version shaped by the market, reinforced the value of authenticity. The audience was smaller, but sharper, more intentional. What emerged during this time was not reinvention, but refinement. His phrasing deepened. His delivery became more restrained, more deliberate. Emotion was no longer pushed forward, it was allowed to arrive on its own. The songs didn't ask for attention, they held space. In an industry that often confuses visibility with relevance, Gary built something quieter and more durable: trust. Listeners knew what they were getting. Promoters knew what they were booking. His name no longer promised novelty, it promised reliability. This choice carried consequences. It meant accepting a ceiling that others were desperate to break. It meant watching peers chase eras while he remained anchored. But it also meant freedom. No pressure to transform, no anxiety about staying current. By choosing not to leave himself behind, Gary laid the groundwork for a legacy defined not by peaks and valleys, but by continuity. And in doing so, he preserved the very thing that would allow his music to age honestly.
For many listeners, Gary Gene Watson was never about eras, he was about feeling. As the industry continued to accelerate, something subtle happened to his work. Without aiming for it, emotion became his defining mark. This shift did not come from a conscious reinvention. There was no decision to become deeper or more vulnerable. It emerged naturally from time, from repetition, from standing on stages night after night with nothing to hide behind except the truth of the song. What once sounded like strong traditional country slowly began to carry something heavier, something lived in. Songs like Farewell Party stopped being recordings and started becoming experiences. They were no longer about narrative alone, but about recognition. People didn't just listen, they saw themselves inside the pauses, the restraint, the way his voice seemed to carry memory rather than volume. This is where his artistry quietly evolved. Earlier in his career, clarity and power defined his delivery. Now, space did. He learned when not to sing, when to let a line sit unresolved, when silence communicated more than any note could. The music matured because the person delivering it did. There was also a growing internal awareness. Gary was not driven by the need to please a changing audience. He was driven by the responsibility to be honest with the one he already had. That meant accepting vulnerability without packaging it, allowing age, experience, and even fatigue to remain audible. Ironically, this was the period when respect for him deepened the most, not always in charts, but in conversations. Other musicians referenced him with quiet admiration. Fans spoke about his shows not as entertainment, but as moments of emotional clarity. He became a singer people trusted with their own memories. What makes this phase unique is that it lacks spectacle. There is no obvious turning point, no defining headline, just accumulation. Years of consistency layering meaning onto familiar songs until they carried more than they originally held. This is also where legacy begins to take shape, not through reinvention, but through embodiment. Gary didn't outgrow his music, he grew into it. And in doing so, he demonstrated something rare in popular culture, that staying emotionally honest can be its own form of progression, that depth does not require novelty, and that sometimes the most powerful evolution is allowing who you are to remain fully visible.
Not every legacy announces itself. Some are built quietly, through repetition, restraint, and the refusal to abandon what feels true. As time passed, Gary Gene Watson's career stopped being measured by moments and began to be understood as a continuum. There was no final reinvention, no late career spectacle.
What emerged instead was something rarer: coherence. His music aged because he allowed himself to age within it. The voice changed, subtly, not weaker, just more transparent, less interested in proving anything, more comfortable with being present. This stage of the journey is not about recognition in the traditional sense. Awards, rankings, and headlines became secondary. The real achievement was trust. Audiences didn't come to see who he had become. They came because they already knew. His name no longer carried surprise. It carried assurance. At some point, the role shifted. He was no longer simply a performer. He became a reference point. Younger artists studied his phrasing. Seasoned musicians spoke of him with a specific tone of respect, the kind reserved for people who never chased the room, yet always held it. There is an internal resolution here that often goes unnoticed. The same person who once used music as a shield now used it as a mirror, not for self-examination in public, but for quiet alignment. The need for validation softened, the urgency faded. What remained was intention. This chapter is not about closure, it is about acceptance. Gary did not outpace his past, he integrated it. Every phase, success, instability, retreat, refinement, existed side by side. None were erased, none were exaggerated. That integration is what ultimately defines his legacy. Not the number of hits, not the decades on the road, but the consistency of identity across change. He proved that evolution does not always require departure. Sometimes it requires staying. In an industry built on momentum, he demonstrated the value of gravity, the ability to hold weight, to slow things down, to let meaning accumulate rather than compete. The story ends not with a farewell, but with a realization. The greatest role was never entertainer or star. It was becoming whole, remaining intact, letting the music reflect a life lived without distortion. And in that quiet completeness, his voice continues, not louder, not newer, just unmistakably his own.